Do I have Kyle on the phone?
You got me, Kevin.
There he is. All right, my friend, you're up again.
All right. Move some slides forward here. So good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon for me. If you're on the West Coast, it's still morning for a little bit. But thanks for sticking around with us, and we're really glad to have everybody here. My name is Kyle Massey. If you've been on the whole day, you saw me already presenting with Zach Geis on the power of data dev, but we're going to get a little more specific here and talk about how to automate your onboarding process. So first things first, who am I? Like I said, my name is Kyle Massey. I am a DataDev Ambassador. I am part of a Tableau COE. I'm the engineering lead within the COE at JPMorgan Chase. I specialize, and my team specializes in automation and user experience. I grew up in Cincinnati, but I've lived in Columbus since 2004 when I went to the Ohio State University and just never left. I live with my partner, Dan. We have 2 pets, a dog named Kevin, and a cat named Willie. I love all things video games, all things true crime, and I like to keep busy doing little projects around the house. So before we dive into it, speaking of coding with Tableau, which has been a theme today, I do want to do a little plug of the Tableau Coders Initiative user group that Zach Geis and I co-lead. We have a link here to our YouTube channel where we keep our most recent, we keep all of our recordings, and then datatheories.com/Tableau Coders is actually Zach's website, and we post links to the videos, to the code, to the presentations, all in one spot there. So if you're interested in what you're seeing today, or if you just want to get to learning more about different ways to code with Tableau, we highly encourage you to join us. We have 2 series really right now. First series was the REST API, and we started from ground zero. We showed you how to set up an IDE. What is Python? What is a REST API? So you can really come to these sessions and watch them in order and go from really zero knowledge to doing, some of the things you're going to see me do here, and some of the other things you've seen demoed today, such as the embedding API is what we're working on now. So encourage you to join us there. We'd happy to have you. The more the merrier, the more data devs, the better. So I'll keep it moving here. So I made this slide on purpose, and I just want to say onboarding doesn't have to suck. If you work at, let's say, let me move forward here. So when does onboarding suck? When is it a challenge? So if you're like me and you work at a very large corporation, or especially in the financial services industry, you have lots of rules. There's rules for everything. Everything's got to be separated. You have to have dev, you have to have UAT, you have to have prod, which in the Tableau world means you're creating multiple copies of projects. You might be creating multiple groups, and those groups need to have different permissions based on whether they're a developer or a tester or a user. And you can already start to see that this becomes a lot to manage. And if you're at scale, if you're doing this at scale, and you have a very small, so point number 2, very small or no really L1 or L2 support at all, you might be taking time away from other development activities or other things that really could be moving your users forward with empowering them with their data, and you're stuck there clicking around in the UI and create project here, create project here, create group, now assign users to the group, now give them permissions. It becomes very tedious, and it's also very prone to mistakes. So I can share, before we automated our onboarding process for Tableau at JPMorgan Chase, our SLA to stand up a new project on Tableau server was 3 to 4 weeks. That's not great. We were never proud of that, but that's just kind of how it works. We have to tell our users, go out and create all these AD groups, bring them back to us, then we'll tie it in and create your instances, et cetera, et cetera. So it was bad for us, it was bad for our users, and more often than we'd like to admit, it wasn't done right the first time, which means now our users they've been waiting for a month and they still can't use the product. That's what we're trying to get rid of. And that's what the biggest gains we really saw from automating our onboarding process completely was that users can have a project the same day. And because it's done through automation, it always comes out the right way. And it comes out in the way that we have to comply and conform to for our own rules. And it just makes our users happier. The last couple things, if you need to stand up a bunch of projects really quick, that can be very time consuming. And again, the human error factor. Or you see that your company is really going to grow with Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud quickly, and you want to be ready and have things automated so that you can just say, okay, you're ready. We've got a space for you. Go and fill out a little form, and we will get you up and running. And that's exactly what I'm going to demo here in just a couple of slides. So the next slide, let's talk about like the old way of onboarding. I kind of spoke to that already. But if I go in, excuse me, just skip this slide. If I go in, and I will share my screen really quick and just kind of show you exactly what we're automating here, just in case this is new to anyone. So if I'm on Tableau Server here, and let's say first things first, I want to go in here and I want to create a project. So I'll create a project, I'll give it a name, I'll give it a description, et cetera, et cetera. Next thing I'll need to do is go in here and create some groups. Maybe I want a group that's developers. Maybe I want one that's testers. Maybe I want one that's just viewers or end users, however it shakes out for you in your context. So I have to go in and manually create as many groups as I need. Then I need to go in and create any users that I want to onboard that aren't already there. Now, if you're using something like Active Directory, some of that syncing is happening for you. But in the case that you're not, that would be just another step that you have to come in here and manually add them. Don't misspell the email address. Make sure you give them the right site role based on what you want them to be able to do. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. It gets to be a lot. And why waste time, precious development time doing things like this when we can just automate it? So now I'm going to walk through what we can do and similar things to what we've done at Chase and things that you can adopt in your own environment that hopefully will help you with this as well. So let's automate. Before I jump into the code, I do just want to talk a little bit about the tools that I used here. Now, not all of these are required necessarily for what I'm doing, but it's just a way to kind of organize things in a fashion that makes sense. So I'm using Python, and specifically, if you saw the talk earlier, I used Flask for some of those examples as well. I'm using it again here. And the main reason being, I want my web application to make calls to an API that's going to run Python functions for me. I could only use a front end and build the really long REST API bodies and use something like Axios and keep it all in one application, but that gets really messy. Some of those bodies are really long, and we have this Tableau Server client, second bullet under Python, that is the Pythonic way, the official Python library for interacting with the REST API, which, in my opinion, as a full stack developer, is much easier. It's much easier to read. It's much easier to debug. It's much easier to unit test. Everything about it is easier, in my opinion, than writing those long REST API bodies that you would use in something like Postman. So we're using Flask and TSC on the back end. The front end, again, I used this earlier in the early examples, is Vue.js. It's just a JavaScript framework for building single page applications. So you might be familiar with Vue, you might be familiar with React or Angular. There's all kinds of flavors of JavaScript frameworks that kind of do the same sort of thing. It's just a preference. Vuetify is the next one. These are just pre-built components, so buttons, tables, reactivity components, things that just are pre-built. They conform to the material design standard, which is Google's design standard, which just means it makes it really easy to build a web page that looks like web pages people are used to interacting with quickly without having to make it all from scratch. But of course, you can do that as well. And then I'll just call out here, GitHub. It's been a question a few times through the different presentations. All of the code that you see here will be on GitHub at this address. We'll share that again. All of our Tableau coders code is there too. So if you're interested, jump in there. And as I say here, steal away. You know, none of this is anything proprietary to me. I would rather someone say, hey, I cloned your repository, made 2 changes to it, and now it's saved us 500 hours, you know, in a couple of months. That would be great. Steal away. All right. So let's dive on into our demo and our code review here. So I am going to pull up this little portal here. And again, this is just a mocked up little portal on a single page application. So I have a little bit of about information here. So just an example of an application that can automate Tableau project group and user onboarding. So I will go ahead and click on Get Started. And what I see here is just, I'm going to see a series of some short forms. And this is, we're just going to collect some information from the user, and then we're going to turn that or provide that to the API calls that we make. So in this case, I'm on a developer sandbox. I only have one site, but if you had multiple sites, you give the user the opportunity to select that from a dropdown. That way they don't freeform it, they don't make any mistakes. I did see someone said they can't see the code. Can you see the web portal that I'm looking at? Can someone confirm that for me? I'll keep going.
Yeah, I can see the web portal.
Okay, I'm not actually. Okay, I'm not actually sharing code yet, but I will. So I'm just going to show how this works. So I've got my site name here. I'll pick a project. I'll call this DataDev Day 23. And I can pick here based on how I did this, whether I want my permissions to be locked or customizable. We'll go with customizable. And then in this scenario, there may be some, we have teams at JP Morgan that don't use a middle environment, everything, or they don't use a lowest environment. So just showing how you can give some options here as you're doing the onboarding. I'm just going to leave them all on so we can see the full extent of what it's doing. So I'm happy with what I put in there. I'll hit next. And next I'm going to get some suggested group names, which are really just the project name that I entered and then the role of the group that I'm going to create. So you can see I've got a developers group, a UAT testers group, and a users group. Now, if I wanted some more information, so what is a developers group? So this group will be able to publish workbooks and data sources in the lower environments. Testers will have read access in the lower environments, and your users are your read-only in production. Pretty standard SDLC terms and setup here. So I'm just going to change one of those group names just slightly so we can kind of show what it does. Once I'm happy with this, I'm going to hit next again. And now I have the opportunity, I don't have to do this right now, but I have the opportunity to go ahead and give the email addresses of the initial users that I want for each of these groups. So I'm going to add myself to a developers group, and then we'll add, let's say, Zach to our viewers group, because I don't really want him publishing anything. That's just a terrible idea. So once I'm glad with that, we'll leave testers alone for now. But once I'm got my emails in here, I can hit next again. And now I just get a confirmation screen. So project name, site name, the permissions, the environments to be created, and then the name of the groups. And then it's including here how many users are being added. You can customize this to show more or less, whichever you prefer here. So I'm happy with this. And what I'm going to do now is hit submit. And we're going to see a chain of things happen here. So we're creating a project. We're creating the projects. We're creating new groups. We're adding users to the site. And this might be a little bit hard to see, but the spinner is actually telling me what it's doing. So we've added groups, added users, and now we're applying our group permissions. And in just a moment here, I will get a confirmation that says I'm good to go, and we can go ahead and dive in. So congratulations, your onboarding is complete. Your projects, groups, and users have been created. Users have been added to groups you specified, and the permissions have been applied. You're ready to go. So if I click here and go back into my Tableau online, I will see the projects I just created. So I can see here, I created DataDev Day 23 Dev, UAT, and Prod. Now, if I had separate server environments, I could create the UAT on one, the dev on another, the prod on another. If I had separate sites, I could do it that way. For today's demo, I created them all in the same place. But when we dive into the code, you'll see where I could have specified something else if I wanted to. So just to show you that everything was applied correctly, if I go into this dev instance of the project I just created and check out the permissions, we can see there's the DataDev Day 23 developers group that I just created. It has published, it has administrator access, and I am a member of that group. And if I go into the production instance and look at those permissions, we'll see the group name that I changed. So to prove that it wasn't hard-coded, I changed it from users to viewers, and I can see it's got view permissions only, and Zach is a member of that group. So that is the amount of time that it took to onboard three project instances, 3 groups, 2 users, and push them all out onto Tableau server. Less than a minute. So let's dive in and look and check out what we're actually doing here. So like I said, we are using a backend and a front end. And you can think about that as one is really an API using Flask that I'm going to look at. And the other is our front end, which is the actual web application itself. I'm going to spend more time talking about the backend than the front end, but all of the code will be in the repository, and I'm happy to answer questions about anything Vue specific if you have them. But I'm going to jump back over to Flask. And again, Flask is just a very lightweight Python library for creating APIs. And essentially what that means is I create something, a URL that I can send a request to, and then I can make Flask do something. So if we look through here, a lot of this stuff at the top is just standard Flask boilerplate to get it up and running. I've commented things you need and things you don't need and what you should look out for. So if you go through the code, definitely read through those. But if we come down here to, let's look at line 26. I'm setting up a route, which you may also hear in the API world is called an endpoint. And essentially this /getSites, that means the URL of my API /getSites will do what I'm telling it to do here. So this is a very simple endpoint where I'm saying get site dictionary by name. So this is what I used to populate that drop-down menu where I said, if you had multiple sites, this would be a little bit more useful. But in my case, I only have one site, so I get it by name, so it can be in the dropdown. So my front end makes a call to /getSites, and getSites returns a list of information about the sites that are available. I plug that into my dropdown component, and then I can choose it, or my users can choose it instead of having to enter it in. The next step that we did in the process was creating the project itself. So we can look here, and I have an endpoint called create project. Very creative, I know. And I'm looking here, this is a post. And what a post means in the API world is that I am sending something to this endpoint, to this URL. Usually it's JSON, or it could be XML, it could be various different things. In this case, it is JSON, where I want the endpoint to have access to that information and plug it into what it's going to do. So anytime you see request.json, that's actually what the front end, the web application, sent to Flask for processing. So we can see here, it's a pretty easy breakdown. So we're just saying if request.json.get create dev, what that means is if the value of the key named create dev is true, then do line 37. Same with UAT. Those align with the checkboxes that we saw on the first page. So checked is true, unchecked is false. So if I hadn't checked either one of these, the if statement would just skip it and not create that instance. So in each instance, it's running the same function. So we can look at create Tableau server project. If you were on the earlier call, this is going to look very familiar. But what we're doing here, we're using the Tableau server client, TSC. It's very, very helpful to create a project. It's as simple as that. So we have our first lines 10 and 11. We're creating a server object, which basically tells what URL should use, what site we should use, and what version of the API if we want to specify that. And then the auth component on the next line is where my credentials. So I have my credentials stored in a separate file because I didn't want to show them, but you could, while you're developing, just plug them in here along with your site name. We enter this context manager, and that takes care of signing us in and out. So everything indented to the right happens while I'm signed in. And as soon as I leave this with context manager, then I'm signed out. I don't have to worry about doing a sign out in this case. So all I'm really doing is the first thing I'm looking here to see is that selection about whether I said locked or customizable permissions. So in Tableau speak for the API, those translate to locked to project and managed by owner. So in this case, I'm saying if my request permissions type is locked, then it will be locked to project. Otherwise, it's managed by owner. This is what's called a ternary in Python. It's basically just an if statement turned into one line. So moving on, I create a project item from TSC where I give it the name. And in this case, I'm doing an F string literal to say, I want the project name from the request itself, and then the environment to be tacked on, appended to the end of that. And that's what I'm passing that from the endpoint to this function. So, and then I give it a content permission string of either one of these, depending on the radio selection I made on the front end. And then if I wanted to add a description here, I can do that as well. But I'm keeping it very simple here. So then all I have to do once I have this information is server.projects.create. I pass in the new project. And I have this, I mentioned this before in the beginning too, I have this returning the dictionary to me instead of the actual project Python class item. And that's because I want to send it back to the front end, and the front end won't know what to do with that. So casting it to a dictionary essentially, not literally, but essentially turns it into JSON, which my API can handle. So that's step one. Step two, we're creating some groups. So we look at the endpoint here, /create groups. Still not a whole lot going on here. What we're doing is we're just casting the JSON to a variable here to make it a little easier to deal with. I'm creating an object that will hold the groups that I've created, and then I'm looping through the groups. So if I had not chosen to create one of the lower environments, I would have 2 groups. In this instance, I have 3, so this is going to iterate 3 times. But in each case, it's going to do more or less the same thing. So let's hop over to creating a Tableau server group. This is going to look really similar, and that's kind of the beauty of this is once you know how to interact with one of these endpoints, you start to see the pattern with the rest of them here. So I am saying I have a dictionary here where I want to just be able, instead of doing a bunch of if statements, I can create a dictionary that's just the role name, so the string of the Tableau server role name, and the environment name. The environment name is the key, the role name string is the value. So when I come through here, I do my normal sign in, I enter my context manager, I create a new group item, and I give it the name of my group name. Now, my new group.minimum site role, which I must specify when I create it, is just referring back to my dictionary. So role type by dictionary, or sorry, role by type dictionary, and the group type, which is an argument for this method, looks back up here and says, okay, group name is this, dev is what I passed in for group type, so then it will put in Explorer can publish. And you could change these around if you have different environment names or need to be more granular, less granular, whatever fits your needs. This is just an example. And then I end it this similar way, server.groups.create, send it the new group, and then I want the dictionary of that group. All right, so far we've got a project, we've got at least 2, maybe 3 projects, at least 2, maybe 3 groups. Next, let's do our users. So we've got an endpoint here, add users to site. And if I look at this, we're going to see a lot of commonality again. I really want to drive that home. Once you start learning this, it all starts to fall in place really quickly. So adding users to a site. There is a small difference here, and what I want to do, and I mentioned this in the other presentation, is I want to make sure that the user that I'm trying to add doesn't already exist on the site, because if it does, I will get an error. I can handle that error using a Python exception, or I can do this and just verify that the user doesn't already exist to begin with. So what I'm doing here is I'm querying existing users based on server.users.filter, and then the name is the user, which in this case would be the email address. And what's happening here on line 19, I'm using a concept called Python list comprehension, where essentially I take something and I just create a list in one line. Usually you do this to evaluate whether something's empty, something already exists, whatever the case may be. But all I'm saying here is that if I make a list out of this item called existing users, which is a query, it's not actually a list. But if I make a list out of it and that length is greater than 0, then I know this user already exists. So I'm just going to append the first existing user, because an email address is unique, and add that dictionary to my results. Otherwise, like we've seen before, create a user item, and then server.users.add, add that dictionary to my list, which I ultimately return. And that's how I am adding users and making sure that if the user already exists, I still want to add them to these new groups, but I don't want to get an error from Tableau Server. So add users to group, plug in right along in the chain of events. So I'm doing a little bit of iterating over the keys and the values in this one. It's not really that important what I'm doing, but the way that the request body is structured I need to go for each key. And then if the value is not blank, then move forward. So let's look at how we add users to a group. So same server boilerplate, and I'm doing essentially the same thing that before. I want to make sure that the group that I supply doesn't already exist. Or in this case, I'm actually looking to say if the group doesn't exist, then I want to return group not found. So that would be, you created a group and something went wrong, server error, or it got renamed or something, just checking for things like that. Same with users. I want to make sure the user that I'm trying to add exists so that I don't get an error from Tableau server, but I'm doing similar things. I'm filtering the group, I'm filtering users, and then server.groups.add user. And all I've got to give it is the group item itself and the user's LUID. And as soon as I do that, it adds the user to the group. Next, and actually last step that we saw demoed here was applying the group permissions. Okay, so we've got a project, we've got groups, we've got users. In order for any of that to matter, we've got to add some permissions for these groups that we just created to the project that we just created. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. So in this apply permissions, at this apply group permissions endpoint, I'm again taking my request body and turning it into, taking my request body and returning that into JSON, creating a list to hold the items that I will return. And then for each group in my request, I'm gonna append the results of apply group permissions by type to this list. So if we jump over to this one is a little bit longer, but I don't want anyone to be afraid when we start looking into this. So there are a couple different ways that you can enumerate over permissions and name them. So I wanted to show both of them. So if we're looking at the top, project permissions by group type. So at the project level, whether it's dev, UAT, or prod, this is what I want people to be able to do. So for dev groups, I can do it like this with the string of read set to allow, write set to allow, or for UAT and prod to highlight the difference, I can do tsc.permission.capability.read, tsc.permission.mode.allow. So you'll actually see both in the documentation for TSC. I like to stick with the string names when they're available, just because they're a lot less verbose, but I just want to point out that you can do it either way. And if you see examples doing it either way, you can usually swap them around. So I won't read through all of these, but so workbook permissions by group type, these are what I want my groups to be able to dev, test, prod at the workbook level, and then again for the data source level. So if I jump down to what's actually happening here, so we've got our normal sign in, and we enter our context manager here, and I'm again filtering, trying to find the project based on the name. If I don't find it, I'll return that. But if I do find it, since a project name on a site is unique, I just take the first result. And I've got big important call out here. So when you find a project from Tableau server, it does not come with its permissions populated. When I say from Tableau server, I mean through the REST API or through TSC. It does not come with its permissions populated. And that's just there because there are lots of scenarios where you don't need that. It's a more labor intensive or a more resource intensive query. So Tableau actually expects you to ask for that. So before I can make any changes, I need to populate those permissions. So I already have a project item, and I'm just going to populate the project permissions, the workbook default permissions, and the data source default permissions. I could go further and do flows and metrics and the rest of them, but for this example, I think those three really are sufficient. So I'm going to, now that I have the permissions populated in my project, I can look at them or I can change them. So I'm going to get my group at this point, making sure that the group exists. If I get a result, then I know the first group, since a group name is unique, is going to be what I want. And this is where we're really starting to make the magic happen. So I can see proj rules. So for the project, I am going to create what is called a tsc.permission rule. And what that takes is a grantee, which is the group. It could also be a user. The same thing would work if you permission directly to users. This would work. You would just swap out a user item instead of a group. And then it takes these objects that I referred to, or it takes capabilities, which takes an object, and that's what I've built up here. So to keep this code cleaner, I extracted out what I would enter up here. So I could copy and paste this and have it go in right here for capabilities instead, if that's what I wanted to do. But this is just a little cleaner. So just some call outs there. So server.projects.update permission. I'm going to give it the project item and then the project rules. And then I'm creating, this is me saying, I'm creating what I'll return will tell me what was applied. So that's where I'm saying at the group type level, add this to my perms applied, which is what gets returned. Moving on to update to workbook default permissions. Same thing. I have a list of rules for workbooks. I give it the project. I give it the list of rules. Same thing with data sources. I go down here, update server.projects.update data source default permissions, project and the data source rules. And then I return what I did. So that was a lot. I know it was fast. I will switch over to the front end just for a moment to kind of show some of like how these things are being called. And then I do want to, there's probably been some questions, so I want to see if we have some time for those. But I'm going to jump in here on the front end. So this is Vue.js. So I've got my HTML at the top. I've got JavaScript in the middle and CSS at the bottom. That's one of the nice things about Vue is it's very separated. It's visually easier to follow than something like React, which is kind of everything thrown together. So if I look down to, this is my confirmation screen. So if I go down to what's actually happening when I hit that submit button, this is where we'll look at what's going on with the JavaScript. So if I go there and find this down here, so I've made this an asynchronous call. If you know much about JavaScript, you know that sometimes things happen maybe in an order that you don't want them to. JavaScript tries to be very aggressive in doing things asynchronously so that it can finish execution as quickly as it can. But in this case, I can't let that happen because I can't let it try to add a user to a group if the group doesn't exist yet. I can't give the group permissions to the project if the project doesn't exist yet. So I have an asynchronous call here that turns on my loader, and then I'm just calling these one after the other with the await keyword, which means, so line 302 will not fire until 301 has done its job, and so on and so on. And then I turn my loader off, and then emit is a Vue.js thing that basically just says, hey, announce that something happened so that the rest of the application knows it. So if we look at real quick one of these methods, so for creating new projects, I'm setting a loading message, which is what appeared under my spinner. And then I'm just getting some information from the props, which are information that's passed in to this component as I go through the step. So don't really need to worry about that. But there's one of the props is an object is an object called project info, and these are just things that were captured from the form. So the name, the type, the value for creating dev, UAT, or prod, and then I'm making a call to my Flask application. So this is that create project endpoint that we saw before, and I send it this request. Once it goes over there, Flask does its thing with TSC that we walked through a few minutes ago. And then the .then here means once that's done, again with the await keyword, once that's done, go ahead and take this project's created that is a member of state for this component, basically means holding the data for me, and I make it the response.data, which is that project dictionary that I pointed out before. The other calls here for create groups, it's pretty much the same. You know, I'm looking at a project info and whether or not to create them. I make a post, and then I store the response into the state of my application so that I can display it in that pop-up or on the review screen where this is your project and this is how many users we're adding, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't go through the rest of these because they are very similar. But if you do go through this code and have questions, feel free to reach out. I'm actually going to switch back to slides for just a moment. And so that was our demo and code review. This was the result. I just like that confetti, so I wanted to show it again. I'll say Q&A. I'm actually going to skip to additional resources and then come back to Q&A. So this is the same slide that Zach showed earlier, but I want to highlight these resources again. So developer program. If you're serious about getting into data dev, you must join. You don't have to, but you should definitely join the developer program. Get your free developer sandbox site so you can actually do this stuff and play around with it. Otherwise, you got to do it more while you're logged into work, and then you get emails, and it's just terrible. The REST API documentation, definitely a good thing to get familiarized with, and also the TSC documentation that I didn't include in here, but is linked on that same page. Great things to really dive into if you're getting serious about this. The Tableau REST API official Postman collection, which is relatively new, but it is much easier than combing through that documentation, which is very thorough, but it can be overwhelming. This is a quick and easy way to grab requests based on what you want to do and just fire them off and see what they do. The embedding playground that Evald demoed for us earlier, I actually used that for part of what I did in our first presentation. So it's a great tool and a great way to jump in, drag and drop, and start seeing what you can do with the embedding API without really having to write any of the code yourself. And then lastly, I'll plug the Tableau Coders Initiative again. Zach and I lead an entire user group about this stuff. Please come join us. Please send us questions. This is what we love, and we want to help other people and make them love it just as much as we do. So I think I have about 4 minutes. If there are any questions that haven't been answered, Kevin, do you know?
I think we're hitting them all. Let's see if any float in here.
Sure.
We did have a question about subgroups that we did answer, but we can answer out loud as well. Can you create subgroups?
That is a great question because it's not something we use at JPMC. I would assume that you can add a group to a group using the REST API.
Actually, you can't. Our good, our fantastic Takashi, who's coming up after us, said groups are flat. There's no concept of subgroups.
Thank you, Takashi.
There you go.
Yeah, were you presenting a JPMC environment, or was so the Tableau environment that I was presenting is Tableau Cloud, but it's a developer sandbox, which is a very small site with like 3 licenses that you can get from the developer program. If you're talking about the portal itself that I put together, that was just something I put together for today, but it uses a lot of the same things that our internal site, which does onboarding plus a million other things, uses a lot of the same techniques and code.
Good question. Yeah, that Tableau Cloud site is a great resource for y'all, and we're pushing a lot behind the scenes to get more into those cloud sites for all of you to keep developing on. So keep using them. A huge resource to the community.
All right. Well, we got a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
No one wants to pick my brain.
Thank you, Kyle. Again, I appreciate it. Oh, we got one.
Oh, this is my favorite. So this is a longer discussion than 2 minutes, Salil. If you want to connect one-on-one, we have unit tested server a lot because we have to for code coverage reasons. I can share a couple different ways that you can do that. So if you want to, like I said, that's a longer discussion, reach out to me on Twitter or Slack or email, whichever. Happy to have that discussion. It can be done. Like I said, we've done it extensively, but I don't have any examples. I don't write unit tests that much for fun. So all of my examples are on my work PC. Does JPMC have a cloud environment? We're working on it. We're a big bank, and banks are slow, and we are a big, slow, even for a bank, but we're working on it.
I love this. Just shows you all that question came in from an employee at JPMC. It looks like that's how big JPMC is, y'all. They're a very great customer, and you see Kyle and Zach were amazing representatives of Tableau. So just shows you the great work that they're doing behind the scenes here. Kyle, I want to thank you again. We're at 12:10 here. We got Takashi up next again. And yeah, Kyle, thanks a lot. Thanks for putting these together. They're great. We're looking forward to seeing you at the next tug.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle.